Thank you, Jan. That was very nice. And I really am happy to be in Adelaide. I was here 6 years or 7 years ago and for 4 or 5 days and met several of you who are here tonight. Thank you for showing up again. My colleague at the time, young woman, Caitlin Cotton, was on her first year in the job, and she came along, and she wanted to come along this time. And here's the choice she made. Come to Adelaide with me, or go to his sister-in-law's wedding. Those are two choices she opted. I don't understand that at all. Anyway, glad to be here, and I have to have a warning in advance. This is going to seem like hell in the Eternal Economics seminar, but that's kind of what I do. I'll make it as unpainful as possible, but I'll give you some background. A couple years ago, we did a study for the nonprofit group, statewide group, Preservation Pennsylvania, on their state tax credit in Pennsylvania. And we were about 80% done with the study, and our client said, hey, we're having a statewide meeting. Could you come up and just give us some of the highlights that you found already? So I said, sure. So I went to Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, made a presentation, and went back to Washington, where I lived. And the next day, I got an email from somebody, and he said, I enjoyed your short presentation at Preservation PA the other afternoon. It was as interesting as the topic would allow. And so that's my threshold for myself to make this. But I thought that was kind of a clever thing for him to write, and so I put his comment on our Facebook page, and the next day I get an email from somebody who had been at that symposium, suggesting how in fact we might be able to make it a little more interesting. Caitlin, that I mentioned, is our design person in-house, and she hasn't quite let me do that yet, but I keep trying to push her in that direction. Well, here's the reason that I know you all came here tonight, and that is for me to spend 55 minutes talking about the concept of revealed preference. And so I'll do that. But instead of trying to explain it that way, I'll explain it this way, in that we could do a thing called stated preference, right? And I would say, how many of you prefer chocolate ice cream? And a bunch of you would raise your hand. How many of you prefer vanilla? A bunch of others of you would raise your hand. That's stated preference. Hey, I like chocolate better. Or we could David could have, instead of getting wine and fruit and donuts, he could have rolled in a cart with ice cream cones on it, some of which are vanilla, some of which are chocolate, and you'd have chosen one. Well, that's what revealed preference is, that you made a decision. You didn't have to vote, say, I like chocolate better. You just took a chocolate cone. And lots of the research we do is looking at revealed preference, how the marketplace is revealing their preference for heritage buildings, heritage neighborhoods, heritage activities. So that's what I'm going to talk about tonight, kind of examples of both stated preference and revealed preference, mostly in the revealed preference side, but I want to start out with some examples of stated preference findings. We did some work in Calgary. Calgary is not in Ontario, so whoever made this slate doesn't know the Canadian province. You probably didn't know either, so I shouldn't even admit it. Calgary's in Alberta. Anyway, they had 4 commercial districts that had a concentration of heritage buildings. And they asked, the assignment was to give them a triple bottom line estimate of the value of those heritage precincts. And so our firm did the kind of traditional economic analysis, and a architecture firm there did environmental measurements, the environmental, and then we did a social value of the heritage, and in part we did that with a series of surveys. We got great participation in the survey, and one of the questions was, in choosing a commercial district to visit, how important is each of these variables? Top of the list was that it be walkable, and the second was the historic character of the area. So that's people saying, I pick because of that characteristic. And then we did a study in Portland, Maine, a wonderful city in the northeast New England, United States. And we did a bunch of survey work, and one of those was, people who live in Portland love living in Portland, so we asked the question, why do you live here? The top answer was the character, sense of place of Portland. And then a different question, we had people say how much they agreed or disagreed with equating. Historic preservation maintains Portland's character and identity. Well, 2/3 of them said that was very strongly agree with that statement. And another 20% agreed with that statement. So this overwhelmingly, they're saying, I live there because of its character, and then say it's historic preservation, in fact, it maintains that character. And then we asked the questions, made statements, and they agreed, disagree, whatever. Rental units in historic structures are less desirable. Nobody agreed with that. Historic designation lets residents have a say about the future of their neighborhood. Strong agreement with that. Historic designation review creates better development decisions. Strong agreement with that. Now, there is a distinction in how most kind of heritage protection the U.S. is and how it is here, is we have individual landmarking, so the cathedral and the city hall and stuff might be individual landmarks, but I'd say 90% of the properties that are under some kind of protection in the U.S. are through an historic district, a heritage precinct, as opposed to individual landmarking. That has some consequences in terms of economic impact, and I can talk about that later. And then one of these, and now you've all taken surveys, so you know these things. There's a scoring system, and with at one end, Portland would be just as good a city without historic preservation. And at the other end, Portland is a much better city because of historic preservation. It was a scale of 1 to 100, and you move your button up and down where you believed. Well, there's what it was. That overwhelmingly at that far end, about how much better a city was, Portland, because of historic preservation. So that's some stated preference. But most of, as I said, most of what I'm going to talk about has come from revealed preference. So in the last few years, we've done 12 or 14 studies of the economic impact in historic preservation at the city level in the U.S. That here, where your strongest protections are at the federal and the state level, in the U.S., there's virtually no protections at the state and federal. Now, we have a national listing, National Register of Historic Preservation, but that didn't come with any protections. Any protections come at the local level. So that's why these studies at that level, because the mayor, the city council is going to make those decisions. So we've done them in big cities, Los Angeles and New York City and Phoenix and San Antonio, and then some mid-size like Indianapolis and Miami and Raleigh, and then some small places like Saratoga Springs, New York, and Frankfort, Kentucky. And I'll just share some of those findings from all of them. So this is where you're going to have to suffer through a whole bunch of charts, graphs, tables, and numbers. So if you see, I kind of like the fact that you all had wine here. So if you're dozing off, I can say, well, that's the impact of the wine. That's just not, I'm being boring with a bunch of tables. I might be, but anyway, we kind of like to think in it's the same firm, but when we do work in the United States, it's under the firm name Place Economics. When we do it any place outside of the United States, it's Heritage Strategies International. So it sounds like two different companies. No, it's the same 6 people are doing it all. But we kind of like to view that our role of our studies is really to be myth breakers, that there's a whole bunch of conventional wisdom about historic preservation that just ain't true. And that's kind of what we hope to do with those studies. So I just want to give you some examples of these impacts in a lot of different categories. Every time we do one, by the way, one of these studies, we learn some new way that historic preservation has a positive impact on the local economy. Well, this issue about jobs. And here's in Los Angeles, certainly a economic powerhouse of a city, not too many commercial historic districts. There's some residential ones, and they call them HPOZs. Historic Preservation Overlay Zones. Most of the rest of us in the States, what you call heritage precincts, we call local historic districts, but theirs is HPOZs. So a place of sizable job growth, but both the local historic districts, HPOZs, and the National Register Historic Districts, in fact, had greater rates of job growth than did the rest of the city. That is revealed preference. Those businesses are hiring. They can be wherever they want. They're choosing to be in those places, and the consequence is this greater rate of job growth. Nashville, kind of music capital of the country, if not the world. Again, not a lot of commercial historic districts in Nashville, but this disproportionate impact. So in the Nashville's historic district, the job growth was 40% job growth. We looked over a decade compared to 9% job growth in the rest of the city. Massive difference. And then this issue, kind of related issue of downtown revitalization. That it's an area where we've worked in for a long time, and a lot of our work is in that area. And I can tell you, I cannot cite a single example of a sustained success story in downtown revitalization in the U.S. that didn't have historic preservation as a key component of that effort, not one. Now, there's different, how much of an impact varies from region to region, the strength of the local leadership and other things. But a city that can say we've had successful downtown revitalization, no historic preservation, I can't find one. There just isn't one. So it's a way that we look at in lots of fashions. There's a program now been around for 40 years or so in the U.S. called Main Street, and it is downtown revitalization in the context of historic preservation. 2,500 or so towns and cities in the U.S. have had Main Street programs. So North Carolina, a state program, had been around for 40 years, and so they wanted us to do a study of, so what's our impact been over that 40 years? So here's what it was. $3 billion of investment, growing every year. It took, the first 20 years or so to get to $1 billion, and then 6 more to get to $2 billion, and then 7 more to get to $3 billion. It is economic development. It is historic preservation. That is economic development. Just no question. The Main Street is the most cost-effective form of economic development of any kind, not downtown revitalization, not heritage reef, of any kind, the most cost-effective in the U.S. And what happened in North Carolina is that the investment came from both the public and private sectors. That in early years, a lot of that came from the public sector kind of seeding the activity, and then the private sector just takes over and makes those kinds of investments. So the kinds of things that Main Street measures is this amount of investment, private sector and public sector, and where it comes from. But also we looked at, is this a big city thing? Is it a little city? Well, what we found in North Carolina has Main Street programs in all sizes of cities. In fact, it didn't matter, that it was coming from significant investment in big places and little places. It didn't matter. And then in the state of Arkansas, we did a statewide study of their state preservation office. They had 3 kind of major themes, working activities. They had a grant program, they had tax credits, a state tax credit program, and they had a Main Street program. And so our study looked at all 3 of those, but here was what happened in the Main Street side, that they'd seen $337 million in capital investments, 78% of which came from the private sector, 3,900 net new jobs, 1,200 net new businesses, and nearly half of their programs, towns under 10,000 people. So this was little towns really raising up their own economic profile using a heritage-based strategy. And so we look at lots of metrics. So we look at the investment from the public and private sector. We look at volunteer hours, and those are quantifiable. There's an entity in the U.S. that says in the state of Arkansas in 2012, the value of 1 hour volunteer time is $19 or whatever it is. So we can take that and say, what's the value of that effort? But how many of you would self-describe yourself as numbers geek? Anyone out there? Well, here's one. Oh, good. Okay, I love you. Whoever you are, I love you, a numbers geek person. So this is solely for you. You can all have another glass of wine. The federal government in the U.S. does some things well and some things not well, but they do a good job with numbers. They gather a gazillion numbers. And one of the numbers that they gather is every year how many businesses open and how many close, okay? So, and so then you can take those numbers and get these ratios of open to close. So the horizontal line here you're seeing is at 1. So if the ratio were 1, it means the same number opened as closed. Over the long haul, it's usually 1.1 to 1.2 to 1, meaning 11 or 12 open for every 10 that close. So we track that for the U.S. economy. So there you can see it's growing, and then the international recession hits, and it falls below 1, meaning more businesses closed than opened, and then there was gradual recovery. So that's what happened in the U.S. economy. Then we did the Arkansas economy, largely the same line, opening, closing, not too much difference. And then this was Main Street programs in Arkansas. the difference of what their open and closed ratio, that is economic development in the context of historic preservation, just blowing away what their state did and what the country did in that regard. But that's not all that we look at. I get young people like Caitlin who work with me, and they always ask us to look at kind of new ways to look at things. So Raleigh, North Carolina is the state capital of North Carolina, 5 really good international universities in that area, the Research Triangle, rapidly growing place, and a very vibrant downtown. Now, I'm a private sector guy, and I like business. That's kind of the perspective of mine, but I don't really care about the giants. I care about the little guys. What are the little guys doing? So here's this vibrant downtown. Where are the small businesses starting up? Almost half of them starting up historic buildings. Lots of other choices. That's where that's the revealed preference of where those businesses want to start up. Then you have Yelp here, because I've been using it in Adelaide. By the way, the pancake place is now closed forever. My heart's broken. Got up this morning, I looked at Yelp, it's open 24 hours. I went, that's where Caitlin and I ate every morning the last time we were, and it's closed, the pancake place. I don't know what have you done in Adelaide? Anyway, in Raleigh, we looked at the favorite restaurants, and almost half of the people's favorite restaurants in Raleigh were in fact in historic buildings. So it's not just the hamburger, it's the ambiance that's created by that historic character that is contributing to that, revealing that preference. And then of course, heritage tourism, big deal. My goal in life, and I have to reach it I'm old, so I have to reach this goal pretty soon. But my goal is, when you say heritage and economics in the same sentence, that the default response is not always, oh, you must mean heritage tourism. Yeah, heritage tourism, it has big differences, and I'll talk about them. It's just that there's just one of a whole bunch, and there's a whole bunch of economic impact of heritage had nothing to do with tourism, but it's there. So Frankfort, Kentucky. A town, I don't know, 25,000 people maybe, capital of Kentucky. None of you have ever heard of it, let alone been there. But it's a recent study, and here's a place you don't think about at all as a heritage place. Well, what we found is that the visitors to that 30% or so of the visitors to Frankfurt were heritage visitors. We kind of dug deep into the survey numbers. We buy the survey data from tourism research firms and sort them differently. But here's the deal. It's not just that they were a third of the visitors, but they spend almost half of the money. That is this increased impact that heritage visitors have over visitors in general. So their whole tourism expenditure, about $95 million, but 34 million of that came from overnight heritage visitors, and another 4 million from heritage day visitors. So again, disproportionate expenditure. When you go on vacation, you basically spend all of your money in 5 categories: your hotel, your lodging, your food and beverage, local transportation, and it's limited to local transportation because, Adelaide doesn't benefit from the fact that Qantas flew me in here, but it does benefit from the fact that I took an Uber here or took a cab here. So local transportation you look at, retail purchases, and then a broad category called amusements, miscellaneous, entry fees, or the other stuff you do. Well, here's the overnight visitors in Frankfurt. Not only do they spend more overall, they spend more in every single one of those categories. And the same thing true with day visitors. The amount they spend is not only more, it's more in every one of those. So it doesn't matter if you own a restaurant, you own a retail shop, you own an amusement park, you're going to get more money from that heritage visitors than somebody who goes to play golf or something else. Now, Nashville, again, big music capital. We deal mostly in the built heritage. We look at buildings and property values and new business startups and stuff. But for those, most of you in here are big heritage experts. So we have tangible heritage, and that we look, but there's also intangible heritage. And it's not something we really have done much looking at, but here's the city of Nashville, whose intangible heritage is music. It is an international music center. That's their intangible heritage. Well, when we look there at tourism, is that there was this link, this connection between the tangible heritage of the built environment and the intangible heritage of music. that people who fell into the heritage visitor category would go to 5 times as many music performances as people who went to Nashville and didn't care about heritage stuff. So it's this connection there of the tangible and intangible. I suspect that there's plenty of examples in Australia of this intersection of the built and the intangible heritage. We don't know anything, so we steal stuff. And a few years ago, I read a study that was done in Norway. And they said, and the study was that only 6 to 10% of the visitors' expenditure was spent at the heritage site they went to visit. That somebody else got the rest of the money. So I decided, well, that's kind of interesting. And we were doing a statewide study in the state of Utah, big state geographically, a couple Salt Lake City and kind of one other, major city. The rest of it small towns, widely dispersed geographically, but many of whom have a heritage site to visit. Well, we got the same answer, that only 7%, it might have been that heritage site was the magnet that got people to go there, but the heritage site wasn't who got the money. That the restaurateur, the gas station, the hotel, the restaurant got 93% of that visitor's money, even though it was the heritage site that was the magnet that drew people there. So for those of you who are involved in heritage sites, and I know you're probably having to go to the city council every year and say, hey, can you help us pay the light bill? And some council members say, what the hell, you guys don't even collect enough in your admissions to pay for the light bill? Well, probably not, but that's not the point. The fact is you're bringing people, and those people are spending their money, they're just spending it someplace else. Now, by the way, the best academic economist in the world on cultural heritage is Australian, is David Throsby. He's the best. He is the best there is. And I'm very much an applied economics guy. Anything I know in the theoretical, in the more academic world, I've learned from David and his work. Well, there's a town that calls itself the oldest European settlement in the United States, and that's St. Augustine, Florida. Wonderful city, lots of historic resources. But they're suffering from the risk of climate change and rising, ocean levels. So they hired an engineering firm that then hired us as a subcontractor to look at the risk of the heritage buildings of their sea level change risk. And so we looked at the change in values over time of heritage buildings in St. Augustine versus the rest of the buildings, and that's the kind of thing we do a lot. But based on that, they have about $1 billion worth of heritage buildings in St. Augustine. So stick that number away. But it's also a giant tourism place. So we looked at the impact of heritage visitors, and we went through they had great tourism department with lots of good data. So we identified that about 30% that we called core heritage visitors, and those were the people who said, I came here for the heritage. And then we had another quarter of people who we called opportunity heritage visitors that may have gone for something else, but did heritage activities while they were in St. Augustine. So that's how we sorted it out. And we looked at then the impact of those visitors, how much they spend on what kind of categories, and we looked at day visitors, overnight visitors, and how many jobs they created, and blah, blah, blah. But there is this approach to evaluating the impact of tourism called the travel cost method. That if I were coming to Adelaide for a vacation, really my cost is, the value of my trip to Adelaide is how much did I have to pay for the airplane ticket, how much did I have to pay for the hotel. It's the sum of those expenditures plus how much of my time am I giving up. The sum of those expenditures is really the value of coming to here. I'm willing to pay this much for the hotel, this much for meals, this much for airplane ticket. The sum of my expenditures is the value to me of the trip to Adelaide. So we looked at that, and we looked at heritage visitors and their characteristics, where they came from, how far they had to travel, how long they stayed, and their expenditures per day to calculate the value of those resources. And we used a bunch of variables, and again, great tourism department, so they had great values. We looked at what the value of the core visitors were, the opportunity visitors. We looked at all those numbers. Forget all that. The value of the heritage resources in St. Augustine, almost $3 billion. The value of the heritage as a piece of real estate was $1 billion. The value of that heritage as a place to visit was 3 times as much. That is the values of heritage. But we do often look at property values. What is the impact, particularly of local designation, on property values? And our approach usually is we'll take the properties that are subject to protections, and again, most of those in the U.S. are within historic districts, and look at change in their value over time of those properties, and compare that to the change in value over time of the rest of the city. That's our kind of basic methodology. So here is Savannah, one of the great stories. If you go to the States and want to go to some place, go to Savannah. It's a fabulous city, planned city, 1750 or 1760. So we looked at the change in value of, they have 4 local historic districts, the change in value between 1999 and 2014. Every single one of the historic districts outperformed the rest of the city. Now, some of those, the Victorian district is really expensive housing. Collier, Brownsville is kind of at the opposite end, didn't matter. Didn't matter. So this is not just rich people getting richer. Every one of those categories, in fact, did better over time than did the city as a whole. And the time frame is not by accident. That if you'll recall that at the last of the 90s and the early 2000s, real estate all over the world was kind of going up at cocaine-driven crazy rates. And then we had this international crash and then gradual recovery. And this 15-year period covers all those cycles. And over that time period, the historic district did better. Here's San Antonio. And again, with the same pattern over about the same time frame, they have in San Antonio historic districts. Then they have a thing called conservation districts, that there's some level of protection, but they're a little less robust and a little less architectural driven. And then they have the rest of the city. The ones that did the best over the time period, historic districts. One did second best, conservation district, both of which did better than the market as a whole. In Saratoga Springs, New York, another interesting town, small, 30,000 people or so, and their predominant style was Victorian housing. So we looked every way we could come up with. We looked at the average value of houses that are in the historic district or not in the historic district. We looked at the average value by square foot. We looked at the value by age, pre-1900, 1951, and 1975. We looked at the per square foot by style, Victorians that were in a historic district versus Victorians that weren't in a historic district. We looked at the condition of the property. Excellent condition, normal condition. It didn't matter which way we looked. The properties in historic districts did better. Now, the interesting thing, the U.S. is a property rights crazed place. When I started doing this, it was like 2 days after Armistice Day in 1918 or something, but the time I started doing it, the criticism of historic districts, usually from the real estate industry and some allies, would say, we don't want those stupid historic districts because it's one more layer of regulation that is prima facie going to hurt our property values. That was the pitch. Don't do it, it's going to hurt property values. Well, this is the area that's been studied more than any other in this heritage economics thing by more people, more methodologies, more part of the country. Virtually every study is the other way around. Now, the same human beings who 20 years ago were saying, don't put an historic district in, it's going to hurt my property values, are going to say, don't put a historic district in, it's going to make my property taxes going to go up because the property values are going. Same human beings. By the way, I often tell local preservation commissioners that I hate to break their heart, but people aren't doing, this is revealed preference. People are showing with their pocketbooks they prefer these housing. They're not doing it for the privilege of appearing before the goofy preservation commission. They're doing it for the confidence that the lunatic across the street can't be doing something to his house that adversely affects the value of mine. And then kind of related issue is, I don't know how bad it was in Australia, but the Great Recession was a killer in the U.S. about what it did to property values. And most anybody in the United States, any family that's not Bill Gates, the value that any asset they have is their house. And millions of people lost their houses to foreclosure in that pattern. We've looked now probably at 35 or 40 cities about this pattern of foreclosures in historic districts versus the rest of the city. So here's Raleigh, where almost one household in 10 faced foreclosure action. The rate in the National Register districts was half of that, in the local districts, half of that. Here's San Antonio, the same pattern, that every one of the local historic districts, in fact, had lower rates of foreclosure than did the market as a whole. Here is Pittsburgh, with the same answer, the foreclosure rate decidedly less. Now, why is that? Certainly people in historic districts, still get divorced, get fired, run their credit card bill up too much. I think the reason is even in weak markets, if I get myself in trouble, there's a strong enough latent demand, revealed preference in the marketplaces, I can get that property sold before it reaches that foreclosure stage. Huge thing. HUD, the Housing and Urban Development Department, the Mortgage Bankers Association, the National Association of Realtors ought to be paying attention. If this was this huge loss of trillions of dollars to households of modest families in America, and there was a difference in pattern, we ought to be paying attention to that. Now, small businesses, again, I'm the small business fan, the big guys can take care of themselves. So here again, we looked at Saratoga Springs, New York. The historic districts had 22% of all jobs, but 30% of the small firm jobs, and young firm jobs, almost 46%, revealing the preference. Here is San Antonio. And the purple areas are local historic districts. The green circles are the numbers of jobs in small businesses. In this case, we use businesses employing fewer than 20 people. Now, it's not that they're all in historic district, but you see where they're clustering. They want to be where that character-driven place is in those historic districts. And then startup and young businesses, the same pattern. Again, here's Los Angeles. Not very many commercial historic districts, but the pattern of startup jobs in those historic districts, twice of what it is in the rest of the city. Here's Nashville again. Nashville's historic districts, 3% of all jobs, 11% of job growth, 13% of startup jobs, 15% of small business jobs, revealing the preference of the marketplace to be in those historic buildings and historic districts. New York City, expensive place at any level. 12.5% of all jobs in Manhattan are in historic districts, but 18% of jobs at startup businesses and 18% of jobs in young businesses in choosing to be in those historic districts. And it's particularly true in the areas of knowledge and creative class workers, that those employers, recognizing what their employees are going to want, are choosing to be in those businesses. We did a statewide study in Rhode Island, pretty small state. We looked at the whole state. 3%, 4% of all jobs in local historic districts, but jobs in these creative class and knowledge worker businesses, professional, scientific, and technical, educational, other services, management of companies and enterprises, and arts, entertainment, and recreation, all a greater share in historic districts than in the rest of the state. Again, here is New York City. You can love New York or you hate New York, but nobody can say it's not one of the most creative cities in the world. It certainly is. Again, that knowledge workers, 12.5% of all jobs, but information jobs, educational services, and here is the core of the creative class workers, fall into the category of arts, entertainment. Almost a quarter of those in Manhattan are in historic districts. So twice the rate of jobs in general. Then I had an interesting conversation earlier about young people involved in heritage and heritage promotions. And sometimes in the U.S., saying, well, old people like me, you like that stuff, young people don't. So we've looked at this issue of millennials and housing. Where are they choosing? So here we looked at age distribution of households in historic districts in LA and then in the rest. And it's largely the same line, except there, where there's a skew, and that is millennials. And then here's Nashville. Baby boomers like me, just as likely to be in historic districts as outside, same rate of the population. Who's greater in the historic districts? Millennials. But it's not an accident. The National Association of Realtors in the U.S. keeps really good track of who's buying what. And so they looked at purchases of houses nationwide. The millennials of all home buyers were 34%, buyers of pre-1912 housing, 59%, buyers of 1912 to 1960 housing, 44%. So again, they are choosing that. I think They're choosing it on the 3 C's: character, convenience, and cost. Those are the things that are driving millennials to choose those neighborhoods. Now, density. I don't know how much in Australia and South Australia you're having density debates at levels of government. Almost every city in the U.S. saying we got to have more density. And I agree. We need more density. But we ought to have density at a human scale. Now we've just, as a matter of course, we measure density in historic districts versus the rest of the residential areas in the city. And again, I say that residential areas, it'd be unfair to say density in this historic residential neighborhood compared to some industrial park that doesn't have any people, of course. So we say apples to apples, other residential. So here is Indianapolis, where it's about a third more, the density, people per square mile in Indianapolis and historic districts versus the rest of the city. Here's LA, not anybody's version of a dense city. It's all sprawling, car-oriented. Again, the density in historic districts twice of what it is in the rest of Los Angeles. Here's the city of Raleigh. Again, at the beginning of the 20th century, they had almost 8,000 people per square mile, and then suburban expansion, the automobile, interstate highways, that falls. But look at what it is today. So the city of Raleigh, outside of historic districts, has a population density of about 2,500 people per square mile, twice that in the local historic districts, and twice that when you include the locals. Now, why does somebody care about density? When we did the study in Raleigh, I had a great young colleague, Bree Paxton, and I said, I want you to find me 2 neighborhoods, and the only thing I care about is one's an older neighborhood and one's a newer neighborhood, and they're about the same size geographically. That's all I care about. We'll look at the rest. And so she found 2, Redham Oaks, Wyndham, which is a newer subdivision, and Oakwood, which is a historic district. Population 1,700 in Oakwood, 500 in Redham Oaks. Size, both of them 114 acres. Housing units, about 800 in Oakwood, 127 in Redham. Average year of construction, 1925 versus 1992. So you got the neighborhoods. So we took that base information and then started looking at other things. Average size per square feet, 2,500 versus 3,500. Nothing wrong with that. Some people like bigger houses. That's nothing wrong with that. Average value, 315,000 to 524. And here is where the city's finance guy gets too excited too soon, saying, yeah, see, we get our taxes based on the value of the property, and that's more valuable. So you just have to chill a minute, finance guy. So then we looked at taxes per unit, 2,900 versus 4,000 or 4,800. So he says, see, I told you, that's why I went, okay. Population per acre, 14.5 versus 4. Square feet per road per unit. Now that taxpayers have to pay for, fix the roads. Well, it's 1,045 square feet of road per unit in the historic district, 2,200 in the new subdivision. Taxes per acre, 22,000 versus 5,300. Sooner or later, water and sewer lines are going to have to be replaced. That's going to cost $8,800 per unit in the historic district. It's going to cost $25,000 in the new subdivision. Annual property taxes, $2.3 million coming out of the historic district, $610,000 on the new subdivision. Now, where's the fiscal responsibility in that equation? And then, by the way, how many of you are going to the ICOMOS General Assembly in Sydney? It's a great once every 3-year things. And one of the tracks is the responsibility track. And I really like that, because in the U.S. we have hundreds of rights movement. You know, right to life, right to die, abortion rights, gun rights, trans rights, gay. We have a zillion rights, and I'm all for all those rights. Heritage conservation is a responsibility movement, not a rights movement. It's responsibility towards the economy, towards the culture, social responsibility, and increasingly we're learning environmental responsibility. So Phoenix, a desert city suffering from not enough water. So we looked at the greenhouse gas benefits of the historic districts versus the rest of the thing, mostly caused by both the nature of the housing and the tree cover, and then the gallons of water that's saved per acre because of the tree cover, which tends to be decidedly more, even in a desert city like that, in the older historic districts than the new one. In LA, again, this issue of demolition is one that is having more and more environmental measurement. Just tearing down a little house, 2,000 square foot house in LA, means almost 300 cubic yards of crap, weighing 84 tons, goes to the landfill. Then this is in Providence, Rhode Island, this building that was a nice restored historic building. There was in the state of Maryland a study done by a guy who was an investment banker who'd done some of these studies before, who paired himself up with an environmental economist. I'm not an environmental economist, so we just stole their measurements and applied it to this project in Rhode Island. And we made the calculation, all right, these guys chose to rehab this building. What if they'd have built a building at the edge of town of the same size, so that it has the same utility when they're done? What would have been the environmental differences? Something between 160 and 210 vehicle miles traveled more with the new building, 75 to 100 metric tons of more CO2 released, taking the equivalent of taking 24 to 28 vehicles off the road, 4.2 acres of greenfield not used because they chose to build a new building, lowered runoff, 2,000 tons of demolition that didn't have to take place, value of natural resources of $80,000, and then infrastructure investment saved between $400,000 and $640,000. Now, I don't care if you're the right-wing fiscal conservative or the left-wing Greenpeace person, you ought to be holding hands and leading the Heritage Parade, because whether you're driven by environmental issues or fiscal issues, the Heritage is the better choice. Then Mike Bloomberg, rich guy, Bloomberg News, billionaire, was mayor of New York. And he said before he left office, he wanted to put New York on the path to be the most energy efficient city in the world. Good businessman that he is, he said, well, step one, we've got to figure out where we're using the energy now. So he ordered this survey, energy survey, of thousands of buildings in New York, residential buildings, office buildings, other kinds of buildings, to see who was using the energy. Here's where the environmentalists have been lying to us for 40 years, saying, you got to get rid of those old buildings. They're energy hogs. You got to tear them down. You need to have green gizmo stuff. Well, no. And this study had nothing to do with historic preservation. He just wanted to say, where we're using the energy. Lo and behold, the older the building, the less energy it used. Every time a decade went forward, in fact, there was greater energy used per square foot than in the earlier decade. Again, lots of reasons for that we can talk about. But so a multifamily structure built in 1980, 13% more energy use than one in 1920. The closest we have to a comprehensive sustainability movement in the US is called smart growth. And I like smart growth because they started out with a real good set of principles that for smart growth, we have to have mixed land uses, compact building design, range of housing choices, walkable neighborhoods, distinctive, attractive places with sense of place, preserve open space, farmland, natural beauty, development towards existing communities, predictable development decisions, community and stakeholder collaboration. So that's their principles. So we've kind of looked at some of those issues, like here's the size of houses in Raleigh's historic district. In fact, the bulk of them are smaller than compact building design. We looked at the mix, this is LA, we looked at the mix of housing types. Well, in the residential neighborhoods in the rest of the city, it was overwhelmingly single-family houses. In residentially zoned historic districts, in fact, there was a mix. There was a bunch of single-family housing, but duplexes, fourplexes. Again, this density at a human scale kind of thing. Miami-Dade County, same kind of patterns of proximity of workers to where their jobs were. So in the end, if you wanted to be a smart growth advocate, the only thing you'd have to do is have historic districts. That will have advanced every one of those smart growth principles. I don't know how big of an issue this is. I expect an increasing one in Australian cities. But this issue of neighborhood level diversity. I always tell clients, you don't have to agree with this, but we have kind of a view from our firm that healthy neighborhoods ought to be a mirror of the demographic mirror of the city as a whole. That white people and black people, rich people and poor people, college educated and high school dropouts, in fact, they're just healthy for all of them to live next door to each other. Just is healthy. You can agree or not, but so we consistently look. So here is Indianapolis, where we looked at the racial distribution of all the local historic districts. Again, some slightly more white, a few slightly more black, but largely who is living in historic districts is who lives in the city as a whole. Here is the state of Rhode Island, and we sorted it by income levels. When I first looked at the graph, I thought my colleagues had made up the numbers. They were just too good. But just literally a mirror image of who lives in historic districts is who lives in the state as a whole. By race, again, Rhode Island's mostly a white state, not big minority populations, but again, they're kind of equally distributed. Here is San Antonio. Again, not a large black population, but it's an Hispanic majority city. Again, who lives in the historic district is who lives in the city as a whole. Now, LA, one of the most diverse cities in the world, I think. And so we looked at racial distribution in historic districts versus the rest. Other, and that's Pacific Islanders, Native Americans, whatever. Other, greater propensity to be in historic districts. Asian, greater propensity to be in historic district. Black, greater propensity. The only people underrepresented in the historic district are white people. And again, the myth buster that oftentimes historic preservation, oh yeah, that's probably cute for those rich white people, but it doesn't matter to the rest of us. Just demonstrably not true. And then Buffalo, New York, a tough town. First of all, they get about 47 feet of snow every year, but a terrible place to live, but a largely segregated city. Now, it's not segregated because you said you can't buy in this neighborhood, but it has a residual from red line, from that kind of a division. And so we looked at the racial distribution for both the black and white population. And it's about, overall, I don't know, 45, almost half black population. And we called segregated neighborhoods ones that were 80% or more one race or another. We called mixed neighborhoods that were 60 to 80% one race, and then we called fully integrated neighborhoods that were 40 to 60% one race, so it's not a predominant. Well, so 70% of blacks in Buffalo live in segregated neighborhoods, but only 55% of people living in historic districts were in those segregated neighborhoods. And then the reverse things on fully integrated. White population, the same pattern, is that 36% whites live in segregated neighborhoods, only 22% in historic districts. And again, on the other way. The only place in Buffalo, New York, where there's a likelihood of a white person living next to a black person is in the historic district. It's the only place it's happening. So if you really want that neighborhood diversity, it's in America at least, it's historic districts that are providing that. And then an issue I know that's an increasing problem issue in Australia, many Australian cities too, and that's the issue of housing affordability. And often historic districts, because there's these patterns of increasing property values at a rate greater that, okay, there's no housing affordability because of stupid historic districts. So we've looked at it, and one of the measures in the states that used is called housing cost burden. That if you spend more than a third or 35% of your income in housing, you're considered housing cost burden. So we looked this was in Miami, we looked for both homeowners and renters. And while housing cost burden is a problem in Miami, in fact, it's a lesser problem in historic districts than the rest of the city. In LA, what the housing people have discovered in the U.S. is, all right, we've been looking at what the price of rent is or what the mortgage payment is, but that's not the whole story, because we also have to look at the transportation cost. Because if you can move way out of town and get a cheap house, but then you're going to spend it all driving into town. So there's a kind of new measurement called H+T, housing plus transportation, as the measure. And so in LA, where transportation is an issue, again, that those who are spending more of their money on housing plus transportation, in fact, less in historic districts than the rest of the city, partly because of the location. Historic districts tend to be more centrally located, therefore closer to jobs. But one of the big myths is we got gentrification, and those are stupid historic districts, they're causing the gentrification. Well, in LA, people way smarter than we are. UCLA and USC did a long-term study of gentrification in Los Angeles, and they printed a map of it, and the orange places are the maps of gentrifying areas in LA. Well, so their study is done when we started our study there, and so we took the map of historic districts and overlaid it on their gentrification map. So the gridded areas are historic districts, almost no correlation. maybe 15% of the historic districts are in the gentrifying area, maybe 10% of the gentrifying area in historic, but to try to say, well, it's historic districts that are causing gentrification, no correlation, just absolutely one of those myths, conventional wisdom, just ain't true. I live in Washington, D.C., and there's lots of cities, particularly in the northeast of the U.S., that have long-term decline in population, some of which have turned around. And so I was curious, well, what happens when the city begins to turn around? Where do those people go? Where's the first place return? So Philadelphia. Now, I don't know Philly very well. I teach there on Tuesday, take the train up from Washington on Tuesday morning and teach my class and come back. But I remember when the 2010 census came out, the big headlines, we finally turned the corner. After losing population for 50 years, we haven't grown much, but at least we've started to grow again. So all Philadelphia, cheering, except they weren't. The historic districts grew. The rest of the city still lost population. Here's where I live, in Washington, D.C. Again, 50 years of population decline. Between 2000 and 2010, decline changed, where about 45% of us live in historic districts in Washington. 62% of the population growth was in the historic districts. Boston turned the corner a decade earlier, but again, the same pattern is that 27% of the population lives in historic districts, but 36% of the growth happened in those historic districts. So I tell mayors and council members, for God's sake, if you want to turn your city around, the last thing you want to do is be tearing down the historic buildings. That's where people are going to come back to. In fact, these historic districts tend to be attractors of growth. So here again is Miami. Population change, 14% in historic districts versus 6% in the rest of Miami-Dade County. The state of Rhode Island, again, pretty flat line in terms of population, not much growth. And again, not many people live in historic districts, but 56% of the growth in the state was in those historic districts. Here's Pittsburgh. Historic districts grew. This is a city still declining in population. The rest of the city declining in population. And then some of you work for levels of government that have a dependence on property taxes, I would guess. So we look at this issue about property tax generation. Here is Saratoga Springs, New York, the value per acre in the historic districts versus not in the historic districts, where taxes are being paid. Here is Miami-Dade County. Again, the assessed value per acre in historic districts, 4 times it is in the rest of the residentially zoned areas. Here's in Indianapolis, the value per mile. So it doesn't matter where you look or how. In fact, these are the places that are generating the money to pay other bills. Now in Savannah, there is some gentrification taking place, and in historic districts. And so we said, all right, property values are going up and people are being priced out. But the fact is the property values going up generates a dividend for the city, county, and school district, the 3 levels of government that depend on property taxes. There's extra money coming in because those properties went up more than the rest of the market. So we looked at the amount of tax revenue generated, not by the historic districts or even the increase in value greater than the increase in value of the rest of the city. So we're looking at this, what we call the preservation premium. Just that premium meant that the school district could get another $3.6 million. The city could get another $3 million, and the county almost $3 million. Meaning the school district could pay for 86 teachers just out of that premium that they were getting because of that value enhancement in there. Preservation also often works as a catalyst. Jen said that she'd been in New Orleans several times. One of my favorite examples is in New Orleans, a place called the Rouse's Market. And this was a 1950s automobile dealership. Sit vacant for a number of years, and then the guy bought it, turned it into a grocery store. Nothing, between Katrina and Rouse's Market, nothing, zero happened in the neighborhood, nothing. Rouse's Market happened, and $100 million worth of investment took place right around it, mostly on vacant lots. Wasn't much building tearing down, it was vacant lots. We talked to all the developers of those projects. Why did you do it? Because Rouse's Market was there. That catalyzed, that single project catalyzed $100 million worth of investment. In inner city Baltimore is another one of the cities still declining in population. Here's an industrial building turned into housing, mostly for So teachers, cops, kind of public servant types. Again, the Miller's Court redevelopment spurred development all around it, and while the city of Baltimore's population still declined, the area where Miller's Court was went up in value. And then this issue that we're still struggling with, but I've always had a kind of suspicion that there was some connection, kind of human connection in historic districts disproportionate to their numbers. We didn't know how to measure that until we were doing the study in Indianapolis, and they said, hey, go down and talk to the Keep Indianapolis Beautiful people. They're doing interesting things. Just go and listen to what they have to say. So we did, and they put a map up, and they have these places of adopt-a-block programs where people are going voluntarily out, pulling the weeds from the median or whatever. Well, we looked at the map and say, gee, that looks familiar. Disproportionately, those adopt-a-block programs were places where there were historic districts, at least as kind of a proxy for that neighborhood connection. And then I want to finish with an international survey we did for a national client a few years ago on identifying best practices around the country. So we did a survey it ended up with 80 heritage professionals from 38 countries, and then including Australia. And then we said, do you have expertise in any other countries? And they said, yeah, and so that added another dozen or so countries. So we had 50 or 60 countries where we could look at these best practices, so I just thought I'd share them with. So here was our respondents, about a quarter heritage professionals, many of you, architects, planners, conservators, about a quarter that were heritage consultants, and then people from NGOs, from local government, national government, provincial government, and then 17% from universities. So pretty good spread of types of people. So one of the questions, based on your international knowledge and experience, which countries have the best overall heritage policies at the national level? Now, you're working at the state level, so you can say, we can't do anything what they decide to do at Canberra, but whatever. So the highest ranking of the UK, France, Italy, and Germany, and then of non-Western countries, and by the way, Western I defined as Western Europe, Canada, the US, Australia, New Zealand is the kind of that tradition. So top, Japan, Singapore, Korea, and China. And then for tangible heritage, UK, France, Italy, Spain, Western countries, Japan, Singapore, China, Korea, in a little different order. Best for intangible heritage. First, Japan, of course, they're really the champion for that. Australia, number 2. For intangible heritage, and then France and Italy, highest ranking for non-Western countries, Japan, Korea, Mexico. Mexico is, in the Western Hemisphere by just not English speaking, and then China. And then for modern heritage, the US, France, Germany, and the Netherlands, Japan, Brazil, and Singapore. Now, Australia's rankings, for best overall, it was 6th. For best at the national level for tangible, it was 9th. Best policies for national for intangible, 2nd. And best policies at the national level for modern was 6th. And then the question was, regarding the country where you know heritage policies best, which of the following best describes the relationship between heritage and tourism? 44% said there's a good balance between the two. 23% said heritage and under-recognized as an asset by the tourism departments. And then about 30% saying there's too much emphasis on tourism at the expense of heritage. Well, this is an economics lecture, so I want to finish with a quotation from one of the great American economists, John Kenneth Galbraith, and here's what he wrote. The preservation movement has one great curiosity. There is never retrospective controversy or regret. Preservationists are the only people in the world who are invariably confirmed in their wisdom after the fact. So that's what you are doing. Thank you very much, and thank you for having me. We have a few minutes for questions, and so it'll be questions, comments, alternative views. Go back to Washington, you communist, any of those. Yes?
Donovan, thank you very much. Very interesting. A lot of what you were saying is American-centric, US-centric. Do you think there's something to do with how people within the US view heritage as to why some of these percentages are as they are? And secondly, has something to do with the fact the age of the US, and here I'm saying compared to Australia, because there is a lot more built heritage for longer in the US compared to Australia. Just your thoughts on that.
Yeah, good ones, thank you. As to the first question, and it's one of the areas that the U.S. I think differs from Western Europe. We don't have many doubters about adaptive reuse. There's lots of people and I don't mean they're smart people, and I love them all, but who in Western Europe particularly will say, well, if you change the use of the building, all the meaning of the building is gone, so you might as well not do it. We don't take that position at all. We say, better the building standing in a totally different use than to be lost. Now, you can pick which of those is right or not, but so I think that your question about does it depend on how it's used, it is, because we don't have big reservations about saying we're going to turn an armory into housing or a marketplace or whatever. I think that on the issue about the age of the country, yeah, but we're lots younger than Europe. And I think within the US, there is a much wider spread of age than there is from the oldest to the newest in Australia in general. From the oldest to the newest in the US would be a longer span. And what's true, and I'll give you some exceptions, what's true is the older the Northeast and the East Coast tends to have stronger preservation ethics, longer laws, designation, than in the West, which is the newer part of the country. Now, some exceptions to that. Phoenix, that's a relatively young city, they have a real strong preservation ethic, but it is very much on, we called our study there Preservation Phoenix Style, because it's very much different. There's no Victorian house in all of Phoenix, I don't think. It's very much, some stuff between the wars, but a lot of stuff, it's 40s and 50s stuff that they just, that is their heritage, and they're unapologetic about that, and just see it. So I think it does matter. The two other differences, I think this issue about heritage districts versus individual landmarking has a huge impact, both on our ability to measure stuff, but also on the comprehensive impact of heritage-based strategies. The other thing, some time ago, I wrote a essay for some UK publication about the difference between the US and the UK system. Oversimplifying, but the UK system is top-down, regulatory, and public sector. The US is bottom-up, private sector, and incentive-driven. And it doesn't mean we don't have regulations, but it is, we're strong on putting the carrots, not just the sticks, into the equation. And that just encourages people to make investments in heritage that don't give a damn about heritage, but it just makes it make economic sense to them. So.
Politicians are always interested in employment, and in Australia they say, well, heritage will stop housing growth and the building sector's 40% of employment, so we need to stop these roadblocks, stopping employment, stuff like that. What analysis of the employment per dollar spent have you done? I mean, for my own house, we spent... Thank you. I've just been bought. $5. For our own house, in a historic area where most of the houses aren't actually protected, but ours is, we spent $400,000 renovating the 200 square metre villa, 1882, and I went to the trouble of actually analysing every receipt for every tradesman that came through, and 70 to 75% of the 400,000, so 300 or 400 was labour employing local South Australians, and only $100,000 was materials that could have come from anywhere. Have you done analysis of the relative comparison of new builds compared to renovations, because every time, my view is that every time a house gets knocked down, it's either going to have a $500,000 or $1 million reno or a $500,000 or $1 million new build that goes up in half the time.
Yeah, in fact, and the reason you got the $5 Australian, so I couldn't afford $5 American, but I could afford is that this is really one of the earliest arguments we started making, and it's one we consistently. In the U.S., rule of thumb, new construction is half labor, half materials. Rehabilitation is 60 to 70% labor, so very consistent with what you're saying, with the balanced materials. And that has this hugely revolving impact on local economies. Because you buy a sink from China, but once you install the sink doesn't spend any more money. But the plumber who installed the sink does. And so to the extent that more of your budget went to labor, it's not just that somebody got a job, is those are by and large local jobs, and that plumber takes his paycheck and goes and gets a haircut and buys groceries and joins the Y. And so there's this significantly greater recirculation effect of those dollars. So the same amount of money spent, that you'll have 20% more jobs created. In rehabilitation, then you don't have to care about gargoyles and cornices. If the only thing you care about is jobs, as a politician, then you ought to say every chance we have to make a choice between rehabilitation and new construction, we ought to do rehabilitation, because we're going to have a bigger impact on the local economy. Sizable, measurable, huge dollars in people's paycheck. Huge difference, and it's the core of the argument, and you don't have to care about heritage at all. Care about jobs, and you ought to be doing heritage conservation.
Hello, I'm Regina Twist. How are you? I was interested to hear, do the states or mayors or whatever give any tax breaks to people restoring historic buildings? Is there any reduction, for example, in property taxes?
Yeah. Again, we're incentive driven. Much stronger the incentive side than the regulatory side. And we do, and lots of the work by our firm in the States, about 2/3 of it is this analytical stuff. The other third is policy recommendations. And so we're pretty good at keeping up with the kinds of incentives. And there's a whole bunch of different kinds. A very common one. And I don't know how dependent governments here are on property taxes, but local governments are heavily dependent on property taxes in the States. But in many states, there'll be a program like this. You rehabilitate your historic building, and you have to meet some standards to do it. But let's say you have I'll make up numbers in my head, you have a property that's worth $100,000 and you spend $400,000 on it, and so your property now would go on the tax rolls at $500,000 instead of $100,000. What lots of the programs will do is saying, if you do the historic building and you do it right, you can have a 5 or 10, or we're doing some work in Columbia, South Carolina, if 20 years of frozen assessment levels. So you don't get hit. So in year 21, you're going to be paying taxes on whatever the property's worth in, but you got 20 years, which is a big motivation for making that early investment. So that's at the state and local level. I'm real reluctant to brag about the U.S. in terms of any heritage policies, because in many regards we're not very good. But one program we've had in some form or another since 1976 is a federal tax credit for rehabilitating historic buildings. About $1,000 a year go into this. And here's how I oversimplify it. Here's what happens. I spend $1 million rehabilitating a commercial structure. I get a 20% tax credit, and a tax credit is a dollar-for-dollar reduction in taxes I'd have to pay. So I spend that $1 million, I have $200,000 of income tax I don't have to pay because I made that investment. 35 or 36 of the 50 states have adopted parallel programs at the state level against state income tax. Now, so that means if I'm in North Carolina, I spend $1 million rehabilitating a historic building. On tax savings, money I don't have to pay in taxes is going to come up with $400,000. I can't be a very smart developer if I can't figure out how to make something work when 40% of it is being paid with tax credits. And I don't mean to overcomplicate it. Maybe I don't make enough money to use the tax credit. I don't owe $400,000 in tax. Well, there's been, over the last 40 years, this program, there's a whole industry created about how that credit can be taken from me, sold at a discount to somebody who does have a tax liability. So I get the money into my project one way or the other. Hugely, hugely successful. And the last thing I'll say about that is, Professor David Listikin at Rutgers University has studied this tax credit program for 30 years. He's concluded that the federal government gets back $1.21 for every dollar that they put out in tax credits over the life of that program. So you can even be a fiscal conservative on Capitol Hill and say, this makes sense. How many programs the federal government make money? The answer is damn few, and this is one that does. Generates more money than the fact that it costs, and it just spurs billions of dollars of investment. And lots of that, by the way, is tied in with we have a different program, totally different, called low-income housing tax credit. You get more affordable housing, and lots of smart developers will put those two packages together, and so rehabilitate beautiful historic buildings for affordable housing. Everybody wins in that system. So yeah, so it really, and there's there's dozens of different iterations of incentives, but it's incentive driven.
We might call it a day there,
Yep.
I think. And
Thank you all very much.
We'll be around for a few minutes.